Hey everybody, welcome to the Addiction Unlimited podcast, where you get to learn everything you want to know about addiction and recovery. I'm your host, Angela Pugh, co-founder of Kansas City Recovery, life coach, and recovering alcoholic. To learn more about me, you can listen to episode 0 on your podcast app or find us on the web at addictionunlimited.com. Hey everybody, welcome to the Addiction Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Angela Pugh. Today we have an interesting guest for you. This is all about at-risk youth and recovery programs and support groups. So we have Nick Rebholz from Full Circle, which is a 12-step support group for at-risk youth. And we're going to hear all about the services they offer and what they do. So let's welcome Nick. Hi, Nick. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on, Angela.
So tell me a little bit about Full Circle and what you guys do and what you do for them.
Sure. So we're a 12-step drug abuse support group for teens and young adults. So the ages we serve is 13 to 25. And while substance abuse is kind of the primary issue that we counsel them with and help them on and all of that, it could be anything from if somebody's struggling with, gambling, pornography, eating disorders, kind of anything that can fall in that traditional 12-step model, So one of the things that, we do is kind of help them with whatever that may be. And, substance abuse being the primary, that's going to be the primary thing that we are able to deal with. Other things we'll do is if somebody comes to us and has a porn problem or an eating disorder or whatever it may be, we'll refer them to kind of the necessary resources or therapists or treatments to work in conjunction with us.
Right.
So we couldn't necessarily be, their primary, but we can offer that support system. The other thing about us is we operate under the philosophy of enthusiastic sobriety. And so the idea being that, if any teenager or young adult is going to get sober or stay sober or, be clean or free from whatever vice they've got, they have got to have something that is better than using. You have to find something that's more attractive, more fulfilling, all of that.
I say that all the time for my sober livings too. Mm-hmm. And just for the listeners out there, we're actually recording today in Kansas City and we're sitting in the dining room of one of my sober living houses, which is really exciting for me. I've never recorded in one of the houses before, so it's kind of fun. It was good to get Nick over here and force him into a tour to see our house. But that's something that I put a lot of emphasis on too, is that fun piece, because I say if my sobriety isn't more fun than my drinking days, right, then I'm not going to stay sober. Like if I miss my old life, I'm going to want to go back.
Right.
So it's super important to pay attention to that part, and I think that's one of the pieces that really gets overlooked all too often is we forget, like, I have to still enjoy my life. As I'm growing up and figuring this stuff out, I still have to have some fun or I'm not going to want to stay.
Right. No, exactly. And that was a lot of, when I was first getting sober, I needed that. I got sober when I was 17 and, everybody in high school around me, I got sober in my junior year. So I still had to go back senior year and I stayed sober throughout the whole thing. But, it was hard, seeing all these other kids around me, going out, going to parties, whatever. The cool part was I really did have something better. I went through a program similar to this in St. Louis and got sober there and was able to, figure it out, stay sober, all that, and go through the 12 steps, but go through it in a way that at 17, it was actually really, really fun and attractive,
Right.
And that's part of what, kind of we do is not only just the 12-step meetings and all of that, but we offer social events on the weekend. So, like 2 weeks ago, we went to Worlds of Fun, and took all of them there. And, we'll do movies and have parties at their houses and whatever, just hanging out, having fun. And
that's so good. That's interesting too, that you guys will talk about process addictions, right? And I've said this for my listeners before, process addictions are those addictions that don't have a physical dependence, right? Where alcohol and drugs, my body becomes physically dependent. Process addictions are gambling, sex, eating disorders, things of that nature. So it's cool that you guys will approach some of that stuff too, because it's so crazy when I stop drinking, it doesn't mean I'm all of a sudden not compulsive, right?
Right.
It's just that it's going to crop up in different ways. So I've been really open this year for sure about my struggles with food and, just having food addiction, and not in a traditional eating disorder sense, but definitely having some food addiction, and just like I was with alcohol. So it's just so important to have resources where we can look at all those things, right? Just because I put alcohol down, that stuff is going to come up in other areas of my life.
Right.
I feel like we're going to have whole treatment centers for Netflix addiction soon.
Right. I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah.
Everybody's binge watching happily.
Yeah, seriously. Well, yeah, and addicted to their screens and Instagram and whatever else.
Yeah.
So
I know I'm guilty of that stuff too, for sure. Same thing with Netflix. Like I'm equally guilty of that one.
Absolutely.
I never sit down and just watch 1 or 2 episodes.
Right. Yeah.
Like everything else I have to way overdo
Yeah.
it.
Well, yeah, or you intend to, and then, kind of the same thing with drinking. One turns into 5.
Absolutely.
Whatever,
Yes.
so.
Yes. It's just my personality. So again, I just think it's cool that you guys address some of that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And, obviously we're going to be a little bit limited in how far we can address that. You know, I mean, if somebody's got a real serious problem, let's say it's an eating disorder, I mean, obviously we're not going to be the ones to take the lead on that because, I've never been through that. That's not what I've been trained for. That's not what my certification is in. So, we're going to refer them to where they need to go to get that help.
Well, that is a special skill set too. Just like the other things, the other process addictions that we talked about, there is a special skill set, and those are areas that I don't get into too much because again, same thing. That's not my training.
Right.
That's not where my education is. And that's not where I am the most effective.
Right. Well, yeah. And we can do, a lot of 12-step counseling with some of that. But again, there's some things that are going to be a little bit outside of our purview, and that's fine. It's just, again, a lot of what we can do is be there to offer that support system. And, if it really makes sense for that person to be with us or not, or, it just depends case to case, but yeah, the idea being that we can kind of be there to help and offer any support. And, even if it's a referral. So
the support is the most important part to some degree too, because as I'm just discovering that stuff, like I would need support in that aspect. I need somebody to kind of walk me through as I'm figuring it out, because I'm not going to know the ins and outs of it. I'm not going to understand it when it's just dawning on me, So yeah, that's so important. I have so many questions. What is it like getting sober so young? So you mentioned you had to go through your whole senior year of high school, which to me doesn't sound crazy because I didn't drink in high school.
Sure.
So that seems easy.
Yeah.
But yeah, like what were some of the biggest challenges for you as a really young person?
I guess the biggest one, honestly, was the expectations of everybody around me, right? So at least the age that I got sober at, like the end of my junior year is when I got sober. And so that's right around the time that everybody's looking at going to college and talking about, moving on with their lives and all of that. And so honestly, I think the biggest thing was the idea that, ultimately getting sober kind of changed my life path forever,
Right.
And so that being the case, there was a big piece of kind of looking at everybody else around me, all these other kids that I was drinking with and using with and whatever, who in my mind, I mean, looking back now, I can see that I was way, way worse than all of them.
Yeah, sure.
But at the time, it was, well, I'm just doing what everybody else is doing. So why is this that big of a deal? And really kind of having that level of ownership for myself for my sobriety, was really difficult. And there was a lot of delusion and denial that I had to break first getting sober to really see, it's just not normal for somebody to be a daily drinker or user, whatever, at 16, 17 years old. And that's what I was. And so I think the hardest part, honestly, was just the environment. By senior year, most of the kids I went to school with were all drinking on the weekends and smoking pot and whatever. So I would hear about it constantly. So honestly, I think probably the hardest piece was feeling like I was somewhat out of place at points, The thing that helped me stay sober was I had, I went through a program like this, one of our sister programs, and having other people there, kind of that support system, like we were just talking about. I mean, that was the thing that kind of saved me throughout that whole process. And I really don't think if I would have had other kids my age who are going through the same thing I was and getting sober and all of that, I don't know if I would have stayed sober. You know?
Right. It's interesting too that you say part of your thing was feeling like there was some normalcy around what you were doing because everybody else was doing it. And I feel like in my private practice, working with young people for sure, like that's something you hear all the time. And sometimes I think it is hard to decipher what is problematic drinking and what is, I don't want to say normal college drinking, because it doesn't seem to me that college drinking is normal in any way, shape, or form. It seems frightening to me. But there are kids that go through that experience and they do kind of grow out of it, right? Where I never grew out of it.
Right.
I mean, I didn't go to college young. I didn't have that experience in that arena, but I just didn't grow out of it, right? My drinking got worse. I love too that you said daily drinking, because I think daily drinking, regardless of how much you're drinking, right? Like that's one of my first indicators in my early 20s that my drinking was a problem, is that I knew I did it more than my friends did. And I wasn't drinking excessively at that point because I didn't have a tolerance, right? I couldn't handle that much. I was a new drinker in my early 20s, but I drank every day. And there's nothing normal about that relationship with alcohol, regardless of if you're having 3 or 12. It's just not normal. Yeah.
Well, and that was the other thing too, because, you know, there were points where drinking was daily for me. It was daily something, you know, I was smoking pot, drinking, you know, every now and again, if I could get my hands on other stuff, I would. I mean, different random pills or whatever, you know, but a lot of it was either I was smoking pot every day or drinking every day, one of the two, sometimes both. And it just depended. And so that's the other thing. And what you're saying, I think, there's a ton of misconceptions about what normal is today. You know, I mean, one of the most commonly said things to me, you know, funny enough from parents is, well, you know, I smoked pot and drank in high school, so I don't see what the big deal is. You know, the hard part is that it's way different, for one, and two, you know, the mentality that sets up is not good. You know, I mean, it sets up, I mean, my parents never said that to me. Luckily, they were pretty, you know, we are not okay with this. But I think if they had, I would have been able to, you know, because I'm naturally pretty manipulative and good at talking and good at all of that different kind of stuff. And so, you know, those would have been my loopholes to be able to go, no, I don't need help, I'm good, all of that. But because they wouldn't play ball with me on that, you know, when treatment came up and it was, look, you need help and you need to, you know, really think about doing this and all of that, it was hard for me to deny because, you know, I didn't have the conception in my head of, oh, this is normal. I did when I was around my friends, but, you know, when push came to shove, if I was really being honest, I mean, I was not normal by any means. Right.
Yeah, I recognized that too, pretty young. At what point in your sobriety did you know you wanted to do it as work?
So it's funny because when I was first going through treatment in outpatient, I remember thinking that I could maybe be a counselor one day or do something like that. And then I kind of honestly just didn't think about it again. You know, I mean, I really loved being sober. I really loved, you know, working the 12 steps and what that did for my life. I loved the program I was in, the support group I had, going to meetings. I loved all of it. But the idea of counseling wasn't one that really came up for me until I had probably close to 3 years sober, something like that. And honestly, it kind of came out of nowhere. You know, it was, you know, I had a rough time trying to go to college. I didn't do very well for a couple semesters in a row. And I remember I was in Pittsburgh with my family. My mom's side of the family lives in Pittsburgh. And one of my best friends from high school, he and I were sitting and talking. And I remember saying to him, like, you know, I'm pushing 19, 20 years old at this point and not doing well in college, not sure what I'm going to do with my life. And I remember, you know, telling him, like, I don't know what to do with all of this. And he just asked me plain and simple, well, what do you love doing more than anything else? You know, my answer was being sober, helping other people and working the 12 steps and doing that. And he was like, well, can you do that as a job? And I'd never, I guess, thought about that. Oh, I actually could do this for a living. And so I went through a training program, and I actually worked in Georgia for a couple years and did a couple different jobs at a treatment center out there, from peer support counseling to I was a shift counselor at a residential center, and group therapy outpatient counselor. So I did a couple of different things out there, and just, absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
So that was probably when I think I was 20. I just turned 20.
Wait, how old are you now? You have to tell the listeners.
I'm 24. So wasn't that long ago,
but very
but
old now.
Yeah.
What would you say is your lowest moment in your sobriety?
That's a tough one. I don't know. I've had a couple that are right up there with each other. Probably the two that were the hardest, that are kind of neck and neck for me, was I went through a breakup when I had like 2.5 years sober. And it wasn't so much the breakup that was really difficult. It was how not okay I was that was difficult. I'd kind of stopped using a sponsor, stopped working the steps,
Right.
And then on top of that, and it wasn't even just so much the breakup. I had gotten fired from one of my jobs at that point. There was a kind of just a lot of different stuff that happened at that point in time, that all happened within the same like week or two period.
Right.
It was like that. The college I was going to basically just told me, why don't you take a semester off? You're really struggling, kind of suggested that. And a couple of guys I was sponsoring were kind of like, something's off with you. And so there was a lot of stuff like that kind of all at once, it became really clear just how bad things were, So that was probably one of them. The other one was when I had 3 years sober, my childhood best friend passed away of an overdose. So that one was really, really difficult, especially because he started to do well. He had gotten sober for a while.
I was going to ask that next. Yeah.
So he was doing well for a little bit, and ended up going back out, and within a week or two had passed away. And so that one was really difficult because, all signs were pointing towards he's getting better, and then he just wasn't. So that one was really, really difficult.
Yeah. What was your go-to thing to deal with that situation? Like, how did you get through it and stay sober?
Honestly, the people around me. One of the things that I've always been, at least since I've been sober, have been very mindful of is I can't do it alone. I think that's probably the biggest lesson I've had throughout my recovery over the past 7 years or whatever. Has been is that if I try and figure all this out by myself, it will never work, and I will never be okay through it.
Right.
And so honestly, my friends was what helped me through that. My sponsor, being able to talk with them, that. And the other thing I think really for me was being of service to other addicts and alcoholics. That was kind of, when that happened, I was actually in Atlanta going through this training program to become a counselor. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of just threw myself into that. I threw myself into, being of service to others, trying to be as selfless as I could be, honestly, because I just didn't want to think about anything else,
Sure. But it's so important. I think people don't understand being of service and really what it does for you, right? Yeah. And I think there are so many ways that it's helpful and healthy for us to be of service. And one of the things that we talk about in 12-step programs is getting outside of ourselves, right? So stopping just thinking about me and whatever I'm going through and how upset I am and what am I going to do and how is this going to work out. Right. Getting outside of myself and being of use to someone else is huge. But also I think it plays a major role in rebuilding us as people. Like that's how I start to feel good about myself again. I have to do good things to feel good about myself and to start to believe that I'm a good person, because I really didn't believe that when I got sober. I thought I was the worst of the worst. Yeah. So you have to rebuild. And service is one of my favorite things. I do so much service. I love it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And that, I guess, kind of was the same thing for me in terms of just the call to do what it is I do. And I don't know. It just is. I mean, in some ways it almost at times can feel like that's more what I'm addicted to now, because
totally,
it just is. It's there really is no better feeling than that. And I was actually talking with somebody recently about kind of that, the thing that made me fall in love with counseling and the job that I do. And all of that really was as simple as sitting down with somebody their first day and talking with them about, how are you doing? What's going on? How can I help? What do you need? And just sitting there and talking with them. I mean, that was really where it all started for me was, hanging out, sitting on a curb, talking with someone, and just connecting.
Those are
them.
some of the most important moments.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we go through that so often too in my sober livings where, maybe I just come over for whatever and we're hanging out for a little while and we end up in these really incredible conversations that are so unexpected, but we just get to really connect and talk about stuff that's important and that makes a difference in all of our lives. It's just so good. Yeah. I feel so blessed to get to do this as work.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and that's the cool part is that, I never go to work feeling like I'm going to work.
Totally. Yeah.
That's always been the coolest part about my job, I think.
I like that you talked about with the breakup, when you said it wasn't so much the breakup, it was just that you weren't in a good place. Because I think that's another misconception that people have is like we get sober, we start, going to AA or NA or whatever your thing is. Right. And all of a sudden, all of our problems magically disappear and we're great people. Right. And that's just not the case. Like I had a lot of growing up to do. Yeah. I was not in a good mind space, and all that stuff has just been a journey and it takes years to work out some of those things. And I always talk about it like it's a habit. Like I say with dating, right? I spent so many years of my life as a drinking person dating, and I always picked the same type of guy, right? Well, when I got sober, my picking skills did not magically improve, Right. Like just because I was sober, I had done that for so many years. It was so deeply ingrained in me to do it a certain way. And I just kept doing it that way into my sobriety. Yeah. And I always talk about, I had a whole separate rock bottom for, dating and really getting myself together in that regard and rebuilding myself as a person and as a woman and becoming strong and independent and working on that codependence. I mean, there's so many factors that go into it. Yeah. So I love that you talked about that because it is about where I am mentally, regardless of my length of sobriety, because all of those things can start to slip back too, regardless of how many years you have sober.
Yeah. Well, regardless of length of sobriety and even regardless of the circumstances of my life, I mean, that's the other thing you hear about all the time, at least I do in 12-step meetings about people going through these really awful kind of hellish situations that, they're still showing up to meetings with a smile on their face and are good, and it's a testament to if they're really living these principles, So that's the other thing I think about too, because even, going through, my friend passing away and all of that, even though that was really, really difficult, I wasn't as much of a disaster as I was with the breakup and all of that, just because of where I was at in terms of working a program and
your mind space was different.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as we say in 12 steps, spiritually fit, right? Like I can breeze through things a lot more easily when I'm spiritually fit.
Yeah.
Well, and that looks different for everybody. What keeps me spiritually fit is totally different from you or from anybody else, right? I have to know what my things are that keep me focused and keep me healthy. And I have to be committed to doing those things.
Right. Well, yeah. And because even those two things happened within the same 9-month span, I mean, so, and it was just funny that, where I was at, I think, 9 months prior to, my friend passing away and all of that was awful in comparison to, not that that was a good thing, but where I was at, what I was doing, what my actions were when he passed away. So where I was at spiritually with my relationship with God was much, much different in a good way.
Yeah. What is your favorite thing about being a sober person? This is my favorite question I ask everybody.
Freedom. That was, I think, the line for me that always stuck out was, you will know a new freedom and a new happiness, and the promises. It was always what stuck out to me, because I remember thinking it was strange that a new freedom and a new happiness, it didn't quite make sense when, I was first going through the steps and the big book and all of that. As I've gotten more time sober, the thing that I love most about that is it's not, I thought it meant I would be free from, all these worldly things or responsibilities or whatever, I wouldn't care and I'd be good and whatever. And I guess a lot of what I've come to realize in my own recovery is that it's a freedom from the things that hold me back, which is my defects of character, my attitudes, my views on myself and the world around me, the freedom from all the things that were really, really negative when I was using and drinking. But I think that was the biggest thing I got, was that it wasn't a freedom that was based in, anything other than I got to start to really, really like who I was as a result of that, and freedom in, through my relationship with God, and feeling like, as cliche as it is, really, I can kind of do anything,
Absolutely.
That was the cool part, was that there wasn't, this feeling of I'm restricted, or no, there's just certain things I can't or whatever. I guess really what I got was I just stopped limiting myself ultimately. And, obviously still will at points and whatever. I think that's part of being an alcoholic. But I think the cool part in all of it is that less and less do I do that today. And only do I do that when I get afraid, when I let fear run my life. So
whoever would have guessed that sobriety was the easier, softer way?
Right.
I feel like most people, when they choose to be sober, regardless of what level of drinking or drug using you may be on, right? Like when you make the choice to be a sober person, wherever you fall in that spectrum, like we're so fearful of what life is going to be like, and how are people going to respond to me, and are my friends still going to be my friends? Are people still going to like me? Am I going to be okay? Can I do it?
Yep.
There's so much fear in that. And it's so crazy to me to sit now as a sober person and think like, holy crap, dude, this is way easier
right.
than my drinking life.
Right.
This is way easier. Like it is a different kind of freedom.
Yeah.
It is a freedom from all those ways that I held myself back, and where I felt like a prisoner in my own head and in my own body. And I didn't know how to just stop. I didn't know how to be better. I didn't know how to grow up and to be a part of, 12-step programs for sure, and get to work with a sponsor and all those things. Like I owe my life to that stuff, and I'm not a 12-stepper that thinks that it's the only way and everybody has to do it that way. I don't care what anybody does. I just want you to be healthy and happy, but that's what worked for me. And that's what I love. And that is still my home and what I really credit my life to,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so it's funny that you said that the way you did, because that for me was the hardest part, I think, was not knowing what I was going to get as a result of this, and in a lot of ways, getting sober was the biggest risk I ever took in my life.
Absolutely.
I had no idea what was going to come as a result. Even all the things you just talked about of, well, what is this going to be like? What are people going to think of me? What do I think of me? How is this going to look? I mean, there was a lot that went into that, especially, this is something we talk about with, our program and what we're doing. A lot is, especially getting sober as a teenager. I mean, there's so much of that already happens, teenagers, being a teenager, I mean, is like the worst. You are too young to be considered an adult, but you're too old to be considered a kid. And you're kind of in this weird go-between where you are told that you are both simultaneously. And
what an interesting perspective. I've never thought of that.
Well, and I guess a lot of it is just that's how I felt, and anytime I explain that, almost any of the kids that, I work with are like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's super accurate. Yeah.
Well, and so it is. It's tough because it's kind of this weird limbo of I don't know where I fit or where I should go or who I'm supposed to be. And you've got, adult life knocking on your door right around the corner, and it's tough. So as a teenager, the first time I touched a drug or a drink, I mean, I fell in love instantly because I didn't have to think about any of that or feel any of those ways, and so that was the hard part is that, I no longer had that comfort or that kind of safety blanket of, well, I can just get
Well,
high. Or,
that anesthetic.
exactly.
You didn't have
Exactly.
your
Yeah.
anesthesia anymore.
Yeah. I was no longer under foreign management. I mean, I had to deal with life on life's terms and, you know, well, I guess I didn't have to, but I chose to. And that was difficult. You know, I mean, I think that was probably the hardest part of getting sober, was not having anything to deal with those feelings, at least until I started to, you know, go through the 12 steps and figure out what that meant and how to do that and all of it. But for a little bit there, it was rough because you had just taken the thing that made me okay for so many years and replaced it with something that, you know, would eventually make me okay.
No instant gratification.
Exactly.
There's no instant gratification in sobriety.
Right. And you told me it would work, but you didn't tell me necessarily how, at least
Or
not
when.
at the very beginning. Right. Right.
Like, when is it actually going to work?
Yeah.
That's one of the hardest parts, I think, is there is no instant gratification. And obviously we are instant gratification people, right? Like the moment I have a feeling, I would immediately grab a drink, regardless of what the feeling was. It was boredom or anger or hurt or fear, like regardless of what it was, I just go for the drink. And yeah, then you get sober and it's like, wow, now I have to sit with all of that stuff. But I do believe too, I always say, like, I feel like addicted people, we are the strongest people there are, for sure, because we, first of all, have already survived a war of our own making, you know, but a war, an internal war too. And we survived that. And then we have to get through this thing and get through all of these barriers, all this stuff that we have to figure out. We have to make the choice continually on a daily basis to do the things that keep us healthy or to not do the things that keep us healthy.
Right.
What's at risk is our lives. You know, I mean, it's kind of a big deal.
Right.
And now we have to just sit in it with no coping skills when we're newly sober, but you have to sit in it and you have to troubleshoot and you have to figure it out. And that is just not an easy process.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And that was the thing is that, I mean, you know, getting sober, I don't know anybody that ever does that, at least in the first year, very gracefully. You know, there's tons of mistakes and, you know, problems and whatever, you know, I mean, I was a disaster my first year sober.
Absolutely.
You know?
Well, and I had created so much disaster in my life.
Right.
That, you know, my first year was kind of, we talked about this on another episode, one of the early episodes my friend Ronnie was on, and we were talking about the difference in the first year and the second year. And where your first year kind of is survival mode, right? Like I was just hanging on. I was just doing what I was told, going to a meeting every day, just making sure I didn't drink. And I wasn't ridiculously uncomfortable.
Right.
You know what I mean? I was a little restless, but I wasn't uncomfortable. But I had so much of a mess that I had to clean up too, you know, legally and in my job and in my relationships and my family. Like it is, your first year is kind of survival.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And, you know, that's where, again, I think for anybody getting sober, the support group piece is the piece that's the most important. You know, I think I would have made a lot more mistakes if I did not have the guidance I had, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and I made a lot of mistakes. So that's a scary thought of, you know, what could that have been? And I, you know, as much as that first year was difficult, you know, part of what made it manageable was that, you know, having other people around me to kind of go, look, here is, you know, what I think, here's what my experience was, here's kind of the best way to go about this, in my opinion. And then choose to do with this what you will. You know, the being given the freedom to mess it up and figure it out was also really, really important. Because that's the thing. A lot of times I think, you know, at least I know I have been guilty of at points when counseling somebody is, you know, well, they need to figure this out now and this and that. You know, I mean, as if I did, you know.
Right. Yeah, we forget.
Right. And so it's easy to forget that, well, yeah, they're not going to be perfect, you know, and that's not the goal here. Because that's not what it was for me. I mean, the goal ultimately was just to do a little bit better today than I did yesterday. And not always did I achieve that goal. You know?
Sure. I think too, for people newly sober, I just want something to happen today that's good enough to just make you want to do it again tomorrow.
Right.
Like that's it.
Yeah.
That's all it has to be. It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be profound.
Right.
But just if something good enough can happen to make you want to do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and then that's kind of, the goal with, the way we work and the counseling we do with Full Circle and all of that, the idea that, again, I mean, I wasn't going to stick around if I did not have something better, I never really do anything unless there's something in it for me.
Yeah, right. I mean, there has to be some reward.
Exactly, right. Yeah, and maybe that's selfish, but it's just always been the way I've operated, you know, and even the piece of, being of service. I mean, I love that because I love the way it feels. I like feeling good about me, so there is something in that for me. But it is like I think just has to be something that is going to make you want to show up and do it all again tomorrow, getting high, getting drunk, all of that. I mean, there was something in it for me. I had something that I was like, I want to go and do this again tomorrow. I had to have something that was better than that getting sober. Because if I didn't, and I think that's the case for anybody getting sober young. I think that's especially difficult because, it just is. I mean, you're in that period of life that are supposed to be the best years of your life or whatever, and even though I got sober at 17, those really were the best years of my life. I mean, those first couple years getting sober, I mean, were awesome, and I loved all of it, the ups and the downs.
It's an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
It also is the thing that made me want to do this as work was really seeing my own progress.
Right.
Because again, when I got sober, I thought I was the worst of the worst. I thought I was the most awful human being that ever lived. I was a terrible person and I was a liar and I was just gross, and when I started seeing the change that was happening within myself and I started to see like, oh, wait a minute, I really can be a good person. Like I'm kind of doing this, you know, and it just made me feel so good. It's like all I wanted to do is help other people achieve the same thing.
Right.
And I knew that pretty quickly. I was like, this is all I want to do with my time. I want other people to feel the same thing that I'm feeling and have that kind of personal victory. And, I mean, it's amazing. And Absolutely. I never, ever, ever had anything like that drunk.
No, not at all. No.
It's a very different reward.
Yeah. Well, and that, I mean, it was all surface level, I mean, everything was from the neck up. And I think that's been the coolest part about getting sober is that it really is. It's mental, emotional, spiritual, physical, all of it. I mean, the change that happened in my life was all encompassing, it wasn't just in, one area, getting drunk, the only change that happened was my mental state,
well, and whatever mess I then created.
Exactly. Yeah. And how I had to cover it up and what I had to do and whatever, I mean, the things that changed there were, I became worse as a person, the cool part about getting sober was everything got better.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and doing this with me.
Absolutely.
Awesome to spend time with you and get to know more about you in Full Circle. And for you guys listeners, if you want to go to addictionunlimited.com/Full Circle, we'll have all the show notes and links to the Full Circle program and how you can get a hold of Nick and all that good stuff. So thanks so much, Nick. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.
You've reached the end of another great episode of the Addiction Unlimited podcast. Candid and honest conversation about addiction and recovery. Be sure to visit us at addictionunlimited.com to join the conversation and access show notes and links to everything we talked about. Love this episode? Please take 30 seconds to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes to help us improve and give you the information you want. Thanks for listening. See you next week.